think tank which was set up in October 2018 with a very simple purpose and the objective of research-based policy advice to the government. All of us who founded the think tank are senior people in our respective fields. We have a team of 3 advisors. Professor Ashima Goyal is one of the advisors. And then we had Dr. Arvind Virmani, who was the executive director at the IMF. And before that, chief economic advisor of our country. He was the chairman of our think tank. The think tank, when we started our webinar series, just around COVID, actually after COVID had set in, we had a very simple objective that it's very, very disruptive COVID thing and could come in waves and would be far more difficult to conduct offline webinars. So we shifted to online and we have been very fortunate. We have almost completed 210 webinars so far. We have been very lucky thanks to Professor Ashima Goyal. We also did 10 of them for G20 and we also did for them the new economic order, new financial architecture, as well as on women empowerment. We did those for them. We have had a blend of foreign speakers. We have had Indian speakers working abroad, Indians working in India. The aim has been to bring the best of the best minds on topics that are relevant for India, policymaking, or are important in the rest of the world and therefore important for India. We've been very lucky. We have had 2 Nobel laureates come and speak to us. We have now Michael Spence, another Nobel laureate, speaking to us in April. And we have Nanak Kakwani, who's a global authority on poverty, speaking to us on April 16. I think it's April 19 and April 26. Nanak Kakwani speaks to us. So we have had a fair amount of good luck that we have had the best minds across the world speaking to us under these. Today, we have a very different from the traditional topics that we have, and our traditional topics are speaking on health, on economic issues, both fiscal, financial sector, monetary policy, exchange rate, and talking about agriculture or geopolitics. Today is very different. We are talking about leadership roles. To chair this session, we have invited Professor Goyal. She was earlier in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Right now, she is working in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank of India, very prestigious. She has been active in Indian policy debate and has served at various important committees, which I have just mentioned, some of these. She's a macroeconomist by training. She has published extensively in macroeconomics, including a book, which is lying here, the Handbook of the Indian Economy. She has been given and recognized through various important awards. She has been a Fulbright Senior Research Fellow at the Claremont Graduate University, USA. She was a visiting fellow at the Economic Growth Center, Yale University, USA. And she has published and extensively, and she also edits a journal in macroeconomics and finance, contributes a monthly column in the Hindu Business Line. Our speaker for the day is Moshik Temkin. He is a distinguished visiting professor of leadership and history at the Tsinghua University and a faculty affiliate at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I understand, Professor, you also go to the Kennedy School and is visiting professor there. And I know how good that place is and how rewarding that experience is. He has links with India. He's also visiting professor at the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad, another very good place in our country. He's done his studies in Columbia University. He has taught at Columbia University And then he has also taught, as he just mentioned to us, in different countries in South Korea, Spain, Mexico, France, and of course, the United States. His articles have appeared in New York Times, The Nation, Journal of Democracy, The New Republic, Salon, and the Los Angeles Times. His newest book is Warriors, Rebels, and Saints: The Art of Leadership. And this is what he's going to be discussing with us, where he takes a deep dive into how we define, seek, and become leaders. It was published in November 2023. And since then, we have been requesting him to come and discuss the book on our forum. But this is the fastest and the earliest we could get to. And translations of this book are coming in Spanish, Korean, Arabic, Japanese, and French. So you can imagine how important this book is. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Goyal to take the proceedings further.
Thank you, Charan, for the kind introduction. And really, this online has been a boon for EGROW, to reach speakers all over the world. Now we have a very distinguished speaker from China who travels all over the world himself, and a very, very interesting topic, very unusual for us. So very interesting. Because, really, this is the age of strong leaders. And it is also the information age where leaders actually need to push from behind, because you have people with a lot of knowledge and who need to innovate and take decisions themselves. But only saints can actually push from behind, I think. And also in a democracy, like in India, we have a strong leader. And I think sometimes in a democracy, you need a strong leader, otherwise you have to be for decisions to get taken place. But people regard that as something that is not acceptable in a democracy, because then the voice of the people gets subdued. So a strong leader and a democracy are regarded as not compatible by some people. So we look forward to your views on this and a whole host of interesting issues. Mr. Temkin, we look forward to hearing you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, for the very nice and thorough introduction, and for everyone who is participating. I will, in a moment, share with you my screen. The screen will consist of a presentation that is a visual one, but I will be speaking. But before I do that, I just wanted to give a little small introduction of my own to what I am talking about. I'm going to focus on the book that I wrote, Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, which you just heard about. It came out a few months ago. This book is the product of teaching for several years now, over a decade, a course that I started at Harvard Kennedy School called Leaders and Leadership in History. Now, I am a trained historian, so I am probably different from most of the people in this session, I assume. I'm not an economist. For this, I apologize. I am not a specialist on India. For this, I apologize even more. I am a historian originally, a historian of the United States, but then I have increasingly worked in the field of modern global history. But because I have taught at the School of Public Policy at Harvard, I have had students, many students, who they might be interested in history, because many of us are interested in history, but really what they're most interested in is, how is history relevant to the challenges we have in the present and to the challenges we might face in the future? Otherwise, history might seem like something which is gone, dead, past, right? And that was a challenge for me, and this pedagogy that I started at Harvard was really a response to that need to make history resonate, relevant, and informative, even enlightening to people who are in fields as diverse as economic policy making, healthcare, education, the private sector, many people in the business world, in the corporate world, really in all walks of life, and in the professional world. And so I devised this course, which highlighted the components of leaders and leadership in history, because that's really, I think, what we are looking for. We're looking for good leaders. And we are often asking ourselves, how can we be better leaders? And we are asking, in moments of crisis in the world, in our country, or globally, what sorts of leaders should we turn to? What sorts of leaders can we trust? And we have no better way of answering these questions, because we cannot predict the future per se. We don't have crystal balls. And even if we do, they don't work. We have history to turn to. History is like a guide for the perplexed. It's like the laboratory in which we kind of experiment with ideas and see how they actually worked or didn't work in different situations. So the book, which came out a few months ago, I would say took technically about 2 years to write, but really it took at least a decade of teaching and thinking to prepare. This is not a book that I could have written without that experience. And it's an experience of having students from all over the world. At Harvard, where they come from all over the world. And I might say, that was my first serious encounter with many students from India, and a beginning of my personal and professional relationship with India through the students that I have had at Harvard, and then in India directly. So while the topics that I will talk about might not be about India directly, I believe that they will resonate with people in India, in the sense that you might hear what I'm saying and say, well, Professor Temkin is not talking about India, but that might as well be India. Or these are issues which we recognize. These are leadership challenges that we recognize. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I'm going to speak. I'll try not to speak for too long, because really what I want is also to hear from you. And so please write down any questions that you have as I speak, and then ask me the question, any question that intrigues you, and I'll do my best to answer and maybe expand on some of my original ideas. Okay, so let me see if this actually works, the share. It's going to take a second. It was working before. Let's see. Is it working? Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, 1 second.
Yes, we can see it now.
You can see it. Good. All right, there we go. I managed. So, okay. This is the book. Just wanted you to get a look at the cover. So that's full disclosure. I am very interested in hearing from readers. You know, I wrote this book because I want my ideas about leadership in history, obviously to spread as far as wide as they can. But if this topic interests you, please don't hesitate to seek out this book. And then once you read it, tell me what you think. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always eager to learn as much as I can from readers, from audiences, from students. So, when I start my teaching, I always ask students to do a quick exercise of visualization, to visualize the leaders that they might have in their heads quickly, not to think too deeply about it, but to just throw out names. And depending where you are in the world, names might vary a little bit, but there are some patterns that recur. There are parts of the world where the name Churchill will come up first. There are parts of the world where maybe this man, Napoleon Bonaparte, on his horse might come up. It's a very obvious choice for certain Europeans. And then, of course, if you're in the United States, one of the most common names that will come up is President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War. There are other parts of the world, where I am now. This might be a more recognizable figure, Genghis Khan, also, just a kind of an iconic image of a leader, even if people don't necessarily know much about the history or who this person was exactly. They will at least have heard the name. They might recognize the image, and if you're in South America or Latin America, you in this audience might not recognize this man, but this is Simon Bolivar. So anyone who is in South America will recognize this leader, this iconic image. And in Mexico, if you're in Mexico where I teach, this man, Emiliano Zapata, the leader of the Zapatistas in the Mexican Revolution, he'll be the familiar name, come up very frequently. And so again, it depends where you are in the world. There are classic leaders, people that are iconic in mythology and art. We have Michelangelo's King David. We have very early images of leadership that enter our heads, and I think a lot of these notions of leadership come from the sorts of thinkers of whom Nicola Machiavelli, the Italian theorist, is one kind of influential figure, because I think that the legacy of thinkers and writers like Machiavelli, who wrote about power and wrote about leadership, focus primarily on individual leaders, agency and of one individual. And let's be even more specific. If I kind of go through these images, I would ask you, well, what do these people have in common? Well, there are a lot of men. I would start with that. They're all men, everyone I showed you here. And there's a lot of horses, men on horses. Nobody knows the horses' names, but it's men on horses. And that is interesting to me. And even the ones who are not on horses, in this picture, Abraham Lincoln, and in this picture, Winston Churchill, they have in common, there's a lot of war making, fighting, the fact of a leader being a warrior, I think is very common in the sorts of imagery that come up when you just ask people to think of leaders. So I've always been very intrigued as a historian where these ideas come from. I think that they come from this notion that we have very early on, that we have, individual leaders determine our world, that leaders really make history. And as I said before, probably the most influential person, at least in the Western world, in that regard, is Nicola Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, which is really sort of an early 16th century guide, if you will, for how to lead, how to achieve power, how to maintain power, and with an emphasis on what the individual leader can do. But I sometimes, after this exercise of trying to visualize the leader, I ask the students to, first I ask them to think about a little bit about where these images come from, and to reflect a little bit on why they tend to give very similar answers, again, depending on where they are in the world. But I asked them a question. I asked them, is it indeed true that the leader makes history, or is it possible that, in fact, it is history that makes the leader, right? So as a kind of counter to the thought of people like Machiavelli, we have one example is the German philosopher, 19th century philosopher Karl Marx. You might recognize him more from this iconic picture. This is Marx as an older man. But the older I get, the more I have a proclivity for showing people in their youth, just to show that everybody was young once, even Karl Marx. And so here's Karl Marx as a rendering of him as a young student in Berlin. But later on in life, when he reflected on the question of leadership in history, he wrote something very interesting. You can see it in this quote. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And I think that what Karl Marx was talking about here is that, of course, individual leaders matter, but we can't understand the world around us. We can't understand the functioning of a leader without realizing that they are themselves products of history. They are themselves products of a society. And that once they are in a position of leadership, and this is true whether we are talking about a national leader or a business leader or a policy leader, whatever kind of leader you want, they have to struggle with circumstances, with structures, with obstacles, with challenges, with other people. They can't just do whatever they want. And not all leaders are incredibly powerful. You have leaders at the very top, the pinnacle of society. They might have institutional power, they might have military power, they might have economic power. And that gives them a lot of ability really to kind of not do what they want, but achieve a lot. But we also have to think about leadership in situations where one does not have a lot of power, when one is not at the top of the hierarchy, when there are actually a lot of obstacles and challenges around us. And there are many such cases in history, so that leadership is sometimes a function of individual ability. It's sometimes a collective effort, a group effort. It's sometimes anonymous. It's sometimes powerful, and it's sometimes powerless. So that's the question that I always pose. Do leaders make history, or does history make the leaders? And I think that there is a strong case to be made for both of those arguments. And the way one answers it really depends on how one tends to view things. Some people put the emphasis on the history, on the society, on the structures. And some people put the emphasis on the leader, on the person. Okay. So one way which I like to approach this is by asking, when do we pay the most attention to our leaders? When does leadership become acutely important? And the answer, I think, is in moments of severe crisis. In times of stability, in times of peace, of course, leadership matters, but really what we're looking for then from our leaders is to continue that stability, to continue that peace. And leadership takes on, I think, the function of management. Management is very important, but it's a slightly different thing from leadership. I think when a crisis hits, a severe crisis, then we need a different kind of leader. We need a leader who is not interested in stability and peace. We need a leader who is able to respond to that crisis. And that's why I wrote a whole chapter on the Great Depression, the economic depression of the 1930s, which began in the United States, as you know, but then spread worldwide to much of the to large parts of the world. It was a severe crisis. We know that the crisis was so severe that it also upended the political world. It led to the collapse of democracies. It led to the rise of fascism in such places as Germany, for example, and the rise of Hitler there. We know that it increased the popularity of communism in the Soviet Union. We know that it led directly into World War II because of the effect that it had on Germany, the effect it had on Japan. So it's a very severe crisis. And in the United States, at the time of the Great Depression, when the Great Depression started in late 1929, the crash of Wall Street, the president of the country at that time was this man, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is an interesting person because he was at the time widely admired as a great technocrat, a really good entrepreneur. He had been a humanitarian. He had never been elected to public office before, and he was very popular, seen as a very serious and capable public servant. But when the crisis hit, his popularity quickly deteriorated because it seemed very clear, very quickly to the public that he was simply not the right man for the right job at the right time. Because he was the kind of leader that was very good in peacetime and in stability, but not the kind of leader that was good in a crisis. And in the next election, just 3 years later, the American people voted into office Franklin Roosevelt, who probably did not have as an impressive resume, CV, and record as Herbert Hoover did. He came into office with a reputation as a bit of a lightweight, not necessarily the most serious person around. But somehow he turned out to be the exact kind of leader that the public was looking for in a crisis. His administration enacted the New Deal, which was seen as a massive government attempt to create employment, to create infrastructure, to kind of repair the social fabric that had been destroyed by the Great Depression. His action, he was a very active president. He was a very aggressive president in his policy making, and he won 4 elections. He was extremely popular and very successful. And the juxtaposition, the comparison between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt raises questions for us about what kind of leadership works in a moment of stability and what kind of leadership works in a moment of crisis. It turns out that those are 2 different kinds of needs for leadership. And we don't know how Franklin Roosevelt would have functioned in a time of stability and peace because he never experienced that. His whole presidency, until he died in 1945, was marked by crisis, first the Great Depression and then World War II. And in these crises, he thrived. And he was rewarded with political support, massive political support. He was also controversial and ruthless when he needed to be. And so this is, for me, an example of how it's really in moments of crisis that the transformative, memorable leaders are forged and created. And it's not an accident that even though Herbert Hoover came into office as the more admired, in some ways more impressive figure in terms of his accomplishments, in terms of the qualities that he brought, it is rather Franklin Roosevelt who left a much more important legacy, because the importance of leadership is often measured by the severity of the crisis that the leader faced. Another leadership case which I go through in the book is the story. It's also from the United States, but I don't think it pertains only to the United States. Just as I don't think that the case I just talked about with a moment of severe crisis pertains only to the United States. These are universal themes, right? And I could be discussing cases in other places, in other countries. But the story of women's suffrage, the struggle of women in the United States to gain the right to vote, took about 100 years. It's 4 generations of activists. It's a very long, complex story. And I'm not going to have time to talk about all of it. But what I will say about the story of women's suffrage is that it raises a really important question. which is if you want as a leader to bring about significant political change in your society, in your country, in your political system, and you don't have official power. In this case, we're talking about women, so since women could not vote, they had no political power, no official political power, could not hold office at the national level. How do you bring about that change against or in the face of very serious obstacles? There are really two options that leaders chose. One was to work with institutions moderately by making alliances, by creating strategic partnerships, by convincing political representatives one by one to vote in a certain kind of way, to make arguments about the continuity of the system, the stability of the system, even the conservatism of the system. And then there is the other option. I have here a picture of Alice Paul. You may not have heard of her, but Alice Paul was one of the most important leaders of the suffrage movement. She was a very young person who, in the last years of the suffrage struggle, was often arrested, beaten, thrown in prison, and brutalized there deliberately, knowing that her struggle would be publicized. And she and her friends and her wing of the suffrage movement made the decision that they were not going to work institutionally. They were going to work outside institutions. They were going to be very radical, as it were. They were going to protest. They would be considered extremists, and they would demand that the change happen, whether the powers that be wanted it to happen or not. And ultimately, when the Suffrage Act did pass in 1920, then for us historians, we have a question. Who gets the credit for such success? Is it the institutional wing led by such women as Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a bit older from a previous generation, or is it women like this, Alice Paul, Paul, who was the leader of the more radical faction, right? So it's a choice, universal choice that leaders of social movements, of sometimes disenfranchised or powerless groups have to make. Do they want to work within institutions or outside institutions? And very often you have to make this choice in any walk of life, which is to bring about change. Do you join the government? Do you join the company? Or do you work independently? Do you work outside the government or even against the government? Do you work outside the company by trying to be a kind of adversary to the companies? And these are universal choices. And I think in this case, we really need to understand the suffrage struggle as a combination of both of these approaches, where they don't agree on the right strategy or the right philosophy, but they have the same goal. Then I have another chapter in the book, which is a chapter which I found difficult to write because it really touches on one of the most devastating moments in our world history, which is World War II. And, you know, one mystery that I have as a historian, many historians have this mystery, is why did Japan decide to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, which then brought the United States into the war and eventually led to the fall of Imperial Japan, the destruction of Japanese cities, and especially culminating in the atomic explosion, atomic bombs dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. The only two times that atomic weapons have been used to this day on civilian population. I know that many of us have seen the film Oppenheimer, the American film Oppenheimer, over the summer, which focused on the Manhattan Project and the American sort of policy decision to harness the entire scientific and technology world into this kind of war machine building. And in both of these decisions, right, and this is what Hiroshima, by the way, looked like in color after the devastation of the atomic bomb falling on Hiroshima. In both of these decisions, here you have the bombing, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and here you have the bombing of Hiroshima. We find that it's actually very hard to identify leadership, the individual leadership. We don't even know who exactly gave the order to attack Pearl Harbor. We know by looking at transcripts of policymakers then, Japanese policymakers, that it was really a form of groupthink that led to it. We know also in retrospect that it was a catastrophic decision because it led to their own demise. So one wonders, what were they thinking? And you see sometimes that there are major events that happen in history where we cannot actually identify any particular leader. And this is also true in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because as you saw in the film Oppenheimer, there is an order to drop the atomic bomb, but really it's a culmination of such a long history, such a brutal war that had been going on for such a long time, that by the time that the bomb is there and President Harry Truman gives the order to use it, it was really sort of the very, very end of a very long process. And so we cannot identify this particular act, which is such a devastating act, so important in history, and left such an important legacy for all of us. Since I know I am now sitting in a nuclear country, you are sitting in a nuclear country. The world is still armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. It's a topic we don't talk about that much, but it's a legacy of this war. And we don't know who is responsible. We can't identify any particular leader. So that also challenges us as thinkers. Who is responsible for these major decisions? And how does leadership work when it seems that there is no one in particular who is responsible or in charge? This picture is a still from the very famous 1966 film, The Battle of Algiers. And it's a film that I wrote about in the book and I teach about in my class because it shows the dynamics of how a colonized people, in this case, the Algerian people, decide to wage their fight for independence against the French colonists. And it shows the degree to which leaders, sometimes on both sides of a conflict, are willing to use violence. And it raises very difficult questions about the circumstances in which leaders can or should use violence or authorize the use of violence. And a lot of this is kind of done in retrospect. But I think the colonial setting is very interesting for these kinds of questions. I know that in India, the anti-colonial leaders had a similar set of debates and different approaches to the question of how to gain independence for the Indian people. And this was true all over the colonial world. But it's true that at least in the political world, in national leadership, but even in other domains, the question of violence comes up a lot, and it's coming up now. If you just watch the news, right? When is it legitimate to use violence, often against civilians? What gives you, as a leader, the right to authorize the use of violence? And it also forces us to confront our own pasts. Because even if we live in a country where we consider ourselves peaceful and virtuous and nonviolent, we have to acknowledge that we often got to have the privilege that we have, the independence that we have, often through violence. And so violence is very inherent to us. It's part of our nature, if you will, and it's an important component of leadership. Now, since I brought up the Indian context, two important, transformative, iconic, and in some ways tragic leaders of the colonial era, to some extent the post-colonial era, Mahatma Gandhi on the right and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar on the left. You know, I actually wrote a chapter about the debate that they had, and the debate was really over who is the leader of the so-called untouchables in India at the time, because both of these men claimed leadership of that group. And the question, of course, is if you have a group that is considered the untouchables, what do you do as a people? So let's say you feel that you are under colonial control and that the goal is to be free of colonial control, and that gives you freedom, independence, sovereignty, empowerment. But the argument that Dr. Ambedkar gave was that that is actually not freedom if my people remain oppressed even after the colonial control is over. So that's why it becomes a question of who is actually oppressing us. What is the nature of control, power, oppression, and what are we trying to fight in order to become free? Is it about national independence? Is it about empowering one's own soul? Or is it about achieving equality within a group of people that is together colonized by a great power, but that within that group, there are hierarchies that as long as they exist, there are large groups of people that will consider themselves still under discrimination and oppression, even after independence and sovereignty are established. So this is a topic which I'm sure you are familiar with, but I wrote about it because I think it raises universal and eternal questions. And there is a direct link between these debates that these two great men had at the time with what is happening, I think, even today, socially, politically, economically, in India, as well as in other places where similar issues exist. Okay. You might not recognize the man in this picture, but this man's name is Fela Kuti. Fela Kuti was a Nigerian musician, but he wasn't just a Nigerian musician. He was the most famous musician in Africa in his heyday, which was the 1960s to the 1980s. He also was the son of one of the founders of Nigerian independence and the leader of the Nigerian founder of the Nigerian feminist movement, Funmilayo Ransome Kuti. This was a family of elites in Nigeria, trained in the British and educated in the British style. But the son, Fela Kuti, became something of a rebel. So by becoming a musician, he kind of rejected the vision for himself to become a lawyer or a politician, but rather he became a challenger to the status quo. So when Nigeria had its period of military dictatorships in the 1970s and 1980s, Fela Kuti was probably the most important opposition leader in that period. He had millions of followers. He was probably the most famous person in all of Africa at that time, aside from perhaps Nelson Mandela and a few others. And for me, it raises the question of, when we think about leadership, we always think about people who are more conventional types, you know, the politicians, the policymakers, the business tycoons, you know, the people in the prestigious professions. Or can leaders come from very unusual places and have unusual sources of power? So as you can see, Fela Kuti in this picture, he's not holding a gun, he's not on a horse, he's not wearing a suit, he's not wearing a tie. He's holding a saxophone and wearing a kind of outlandish outfit. But in a sense, this alternative form of power made him the largest threat, the biggest threat to the military dictatorship that ruled Nigeria in his day, and they were constantly throwing him in prison, invading his compound, really fighting him as if he was the biggest threat to the Nigerian government that one could imagine. I'm fascinated by that. How is a musician such a big threat to generals, people who have an army? That is because leadership, and sometimes the most powerful leadership, can come from sources that we don't expect. And music, as you all probably know, is a very powerful force in our lives, in our psyches. It's something that we grow up with. It's in every culture and civilization. And when harnessed with other forms of leadership, whether it's business leadership, political leadership, social leadership, it can be irresistible. And Fela Kuti, when you read my book, you will see, was a very interesting example of a kind of alternative form of leadership. Finally, in my book, I examine what I consider to be the legacy of really transformative leaders and who actually made the world as we live in it today. And when I say we, I'm using the royal we. So the royal we means that whether you're in Britain or in the United States or in India or even in China, there are some important legacies established by leaders of the particular era around the end of the Cold War, toward the end of the Cold War. And in particular, I would say the most significant, most influential leader, in my opinion, is Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1979 and 1990. And I, without getting too much into her career, I'd say that this quote really encapsulates how she thought of things, how she thought of the world, when she said, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." Now, of course, she didn't mean by this that society is something that didn't exist. She meant it as a value. She meant that we need to think of ourselves primarily as individuals, pulling ourselves by our bootstraps, taking care of ourselves individually, not waiting for society to take care of us, not waiting for other people to help us, but rather to help ourselves. And whatever one thinks about this kind of way of looking at the world, I would argue it has been hugely influential. Thatcher is, more than any other person, the one who really helped make the world that we live in today, which is characterized, I would argue, by a very heightened individualism, especially in the economic sphere, a sense that we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, a very skeptical attitude toward society as a kind of function of progress, and the idea that to demand kind of solidarity across groups, that we should think of ourselves collectively rather than individually, is very suspect and has become, in some places, extremely marginalized compared to where it was when Margaret Thatcher came into office in 1979. But there are alternatives to that viewpoint, and I think that today, if I had to generalize, in many different parts of the world, there's a different legacy that is at play. And here in this picture, you have Martin Luther King Jr. on the left and Malcolm X, the African-American leader, very different kind of leader on the right. And they differed in many things about how to fight for equality for African-Americans in the United States in the era of the civil rights movement. But I think what they had in common was this idea that progress is not something that happens individually. Progress is not just a question of representation. Progress can be measured only when society as a whole moves forward. But there is something called the common good, the public good, by which we all measure our progress, and that we are all somehow together, bound together in some kind of common destiny. And this form of leadership, I think, is in a permanent struggle with the more individualized, individual kind of leadership that I showed before. And what we're seeing, I think, today, again, as a very large generalization, is really how to understand ourselves as leaders, the leaders that we have around us. Is it a matter of individual success? Should we associate leadership with individuals, or should we associate leaders with a kind of collective effort? So, I think with that, I'm going to stop the share. Let's see if this goes back to normal. Yes. And I'm going to open it up. I'm going to open it up for questions. I realized that what I did now, although I probably took a lot of time, was kind of really rush through a lot of the important topics that I think are coming out of this study of leaders and leadership in history, and giving you examples of this. Some of it will be familiar, some less, but really any responses and comments that you have, I'm eager to hear, and I'll try to answer in whatever time we have left.
I think really interesting, Rich, to try and extract, kind of trends out of individuals and instances all over the world. So what I see as a major kind of perhaps trend is that where you have strong institutions, modern institutions of government, say a democracy, and you had the earlier warrior kings or kings and inheritance, and where it was much more individualistic, and a leader would be defined by violence, by winning. Well, so just coming to the working, as you said, our interest is in applying history to understand ourselves today. So coming to like one fact that really struck me was that FDR won 4 elections. At
Yes.
that time in the US, did anybody say democracy is threatened by a strong leader? Someone who wins 4 elections means that democracy is not going to work. In India, we're going into an election and there are people
Yes.
who are saying that you don't have an opposition if the same party wins, So where institutions are strong, that should not be the case, right? The institutions should survive a person. And also this idea of people revolting or rebelling or working within the system or using violence and working outside. Because there also, I think you can be much more effective if you work within the system, but if you want to set up independent leadership, build a leader, it has to be outside the system. And then you're antagonistic and you're known for yourself and so on. So leadership seems to be associated with violence in some way. I don't know, just some reactions.
Sure. Thank you for that. So those are 2 separate topics. It's actually 3, if I take it far. Let me address the first about the winning elections. As a historian, my very most simple reaction to someone winning various elections is, why is that person popular? I'm interested. I want to know the sources of the popularity. What is that person addressing? That is, because usually if elections are fair, if the democracy is relatively healthy, and then we can have debates about how healthy a particular democracy is, which I leave to the side now. I want to see what are the issues or what are the reasons why the particular leader is very successful. In the case of Roosevelt and FDR, he won 4 elections. In fact, he won so many elections that after that they put in term limits. That's why the United States has term limits today for presidents, 2 terms. As FDR was just won too many elections. And but it's why? Why did he win so many elections? It was because, quite simply, he consistently was able to persuade a plurality of the American voting public that he had their best interests at heart. And what's fascinating is that if you know a little bit about the United States, it's a very divided, politically and socially divided country with many kind of historical problems. But he had what they called the coalition of voters, the New Deal coalition, which consisted of very disparate groups. There were white farmers, there were religious and ethnic minorities, there were African Americans, there were industrial workers, and there were Southerners. And these people were very different from each other and sometimes had nothing in common, but what they all had in common is that they really loved Roosevelt. And that's a fascinating thing, right? That he managed to get them all together despite all these differences. And there was a sense that he was threatening democracy because, for example, I'll give you an example. He created the New Deal, and at some point during the New Deal, the Supreme Court in the United States started saying that certain measures in the New Deal were unconstitutional. And Roosevelt's, a lot of presidents at that point, especially the more polite ones, would in that case say, oh, well, the Supreme Court has had its say, and now, I'm going to bow before the authority of the Supreme Court because I respect democracy, checks and balances, and all this other. Roosevelt's answer was, oh, you're saying it's unconstitutional. Well, I'm going to appoint as many judges as I need to the Supreme Court until I get a majority that says that it is constitutional, because I am the president and my job, with all due respect to the Constitution and the Supreme Court, is to feed the struggling, starving American people, which was a very severe crisis. And he also said, look, guys, the whole world is going into fascism and communism. And if you really want to protect our system, we have to do what is necessary to protect the fabric of society. And in the end, the Supreme Court backed off and they said, oh, actually, maybe it is constitutional. Now, a lot of people said at that point, Roosevelt is a dictator. He's not respecting the Supreme Court. He's a bully. But at the same time, I would argue that had Roosevelt not been the president at that time, the United States might not have remained a democracy or even a capitalist system. That's how bad the crisis was. People don't always fully appreciate that. So we have to make trade-offs. Okay? And it's very similar, I think, with the question of violence, because again, it's not an abstract thing. Sometimes, there are debates that we have about when is violence justified. Is it justified to use violence, for example, to gain your freedom from colonial control or from invasion? Is it legitimate to use violence against groups that you consider to be a threat to national security? These things come up all the time. It's not for me to give definitive answers, but it's an inescapable part of leadership in history, and we cannot avoid it. Cannot avoid the topic and just treat it as if it's not there.
But in India, we've had a lot of success, like our independence struggle. Non-violence had a major part in it. And for example, the Palestinian people now, such a tragedy going on in the world. These endless cycles of violence. But
yes.
Apparently, because they have this tradition of war, and they were not, people tried working with them, to persuade them to adopt non-violence. It worked with Martin Luther King in the US, but in Palestine.
Sometimes non-violent leaders are the ones who are the most brutalized, thrown in prison, and you never hear from them again. Unfortunately, that is often what happens with these struggles. It's actually the violent ones. And if you want to really get specific, Hamas is an organization that the Israeli government actually spent a lot of time cultivating because they thought it would serve their interest to have them there, rather than the non-violent ones who are many of them are either dead or in prison. So it's a complicated story, but even in India, as anyone will tell you, it wasn't just non-violence. There was always a militant, violent component to the anti-colonial struggle in India, even when Gandhi was at the zenith of his influence.
Yes, of course, that's true. Now let's we open it to the floor. Charan, you have some questions. Please go ahead, your hand.
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. I thought it was very, very interesting and very fascinating. And two thoughts come to my mind, Temkin. One is, when did this era of actors and comedians make it to the top leadership? So is it the popularity in America? You know that some of your presidents have been actors, very successful actors, and some of the governors have been very successful actors. The comedians are also running some of the countries. So when did that really come? Because then these were, I would say, quote unquote, little light in training. I can understand other leaders who are coming up, they're coming out through a very rigorous process, be it Washington, be it Abraham Lincoln, coming through a very rigorous process. But here you get somebody who's simply seen in public, and public starts reposing confidence in them that they can be our good leaders.
Yes.
So when did that happen, and is there any historical evidence or historical study that did they in the long run turn out to be really good leaders? Like you said that Roosevelt, had he not been there, probably the democratic foundations would have been shaky. So, so that is one. The other is the trend that you see nowadays. On one hand, you had an Harvard educated, very popular American president, and he came against all odds. And I'm not sure, you said America is a very divided society. I'm not very sure if next time for the presidential candidate you would have an odd man out like the Harvard educated. I'm not sure when the lady will become the president in America. On the one hand, you have such highly educated leaders. On the other hand, sometimes you have leaders which are there just because of um, not educated, not visionary, but just the system has thrown them up, and then they lead into crisis or difficult times.
Yes.
So, any comparative picture you have?
Well, so for your first question about actors and comedians, I didn't think of it that way. I would say, yeah, the United States had, for example, Ronald Reagan was president, elected in 1980. Ronald Reagan was a second-rate B-movie actor in Hollywood. He actually was already a politician when he was an actor because he was the president of the Actors Union, which is actually an important union. So he was politically active very early on. And then he went into politics, became governor of California. I consider Donald Trump to be an actor. You know, he was on television for many years as the host of The Apprentice, which is a fake business reality show where he was pretending to be a very successful businessman when he's actually not a very successful businessman. And Ukraine's president, Mr. Zelensky, is a former television comedian, a fairly decent one, if I understand correctly, although I don't myself speak Ukrainian. So there are some people like that. I think the interesting part of it is not just politicians or leaders who used to be actors and comedians, but more the involvement of people in very visible celebrity roles in political life as leaders. So, they're influential, people listen to them, their followers listen to them. You have singers with millions and millions of young women following them who might, be influenced by what they're saying. And honestly, I don't see this as any kind of problematic thing. I actually am in favor, personally, of as much political participation in a democracy as possible from all sectors of society. I don't believe that political leadership should just be something kind of segregated to professional politicians. So it's I think, a historical phenomenon that in the modern world, with the rise of visual media, with the rise of social media, with the importance of television and cinema and popular music, it is and even sports, athletics, people get involved in politics, as you know. Those are also very popular people. And that's just going to be a fact of life. So I think it's actually a sign of a robust democracy when you have people coming in to political activism or leadership from different walks of life, as long as they are serious about politics and as long as they're not just doing it for money or just out of self-interest or because they think it's something that they want to do for their brand, right? So I can't generalize about whether it's good or bad, but I can tell you that is a phenomenon that is, I think, here to stay. As long as we are in this world where these sectors of society are so influential and so important. And then your second question was about sort of leaders being thrown. It's true. We have to understand leaders as the products of the system that we have. And I think, again, the United States is actually a good example. It's the political system that really explains the candidacies that we see. So we are now in the United States entering an electoral campaign for president in 2024, in which both of the candidates are at an approval rating of about 40% or less, which means that they're both unpopular. And it's very incredible to think about how in a democracy, the only two options that are being offered to the public are two candidates who are both unpopular, very unpopular, in fact. That is quite astonishing, and you can only explain that by looking at the system that throw them up. So sometimes we can't just focus on the individual leaders. We have to look at what is producing them. In this case, we have two political parties in the United States, and they're not like parties. It's not even like India, where you have parties that can form. You have regional parties, and in the United States, the parties are the pillars of the system. They're actually that's how the system is formed. The system is formed by the two parties. And so when people have no choice but to just select between the candidates that these two parties select, then you get this alienating sense that the candidates are not what the voting public is actually looking for, right? Contrary to what you might think, Donald Trump has never been a popular president or even politician. He has his base, but there's a system that helps him. Joe Biden is also not particularly popular. So I think it's a very interesting thing to see the interaction between those two things.
There are
please,
some hands up. Darren, you finished? So, SN Singh, would you like to ask your question?
yes, madam.
Yeah, please keep it brief.
Sir, Professor Moshik has given a very controversial statement about the leadership and politics. But I think these two are the different kind of personalities. Leadership is different, and becoming a politician, that is because there are many criteria to become a politician. But leadership is an individual characteristics, unique characteristics. Most of the
Thank
leaders.
you. I think we are running out of time. So now I ask Edward Pratap Singh to ask his question.
Yes, ma'am.
We'll collect a few questions. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So I had like the presentation from the beginning, there was a question raised by Moshik sir there regarding whether history creates leaders or do leaders create history. So that is something that has been very intriguing. And what I feel is leaders are irrespective of whether they have gone down in history, their decisions and their policies at that point of time have really made them either famous leaders or infamous leaders. For instance, the Western side, the leadership ideas of Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and even we have come across several other leaders, even the Nigerian leader that the speaker had mentioned. But in the Indian context, especially if you take even in the recent past, during the 1970s, when Indira Gandhi was the prime minister of our country, she was in the initial stages in her prime ministership, how famous she was. Now, if you look at the same character of how the public view her, it's totally become infamous for her implementation of emergency. So it is the decisions that they make makes them either famous, irrespective of whether they are on horses or whether they have a.
Okay, thank you.
The decisions that they make, the policy.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat group. One is somewhat related, the role of art and marketing in creating leaders. And another is there is a counter feeling that violence is a necessary evil to maintain peace. So this group of questions, if you'd like to respond.
Okay, and I also see a comment about Arnold Schwarzenegger. I like Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Constitution in the United States prevents him from running for president because it says that there's a clause that implies that you have to be a native-born American to run for president, which is, I think, a very problematic clause. I'm sure that I actually am confident that if Arnold Schwarzenegger was able to run for president, he would win. He's actually a very popular person. The counter feeling about violence as a necessary evil. Well, look, we have to be very careful because that is a slippery slope. It is very often used by leaders as an excuse or an opportunity to use violence with the idea that they are helping people, that they're purifying the nation, protecting the nation. So that's a road that I'm very hesitant to go down on. I would never myself advocate that kind of just general abstract language about violence. I can only talk about specific instances. So I think that, it's a very difficult question about when a leader authorizes violence, and we really have to judge it based on, very often it comes down to our values, and values vary from individual to individual, from group to group. But I would say if there is a rule in which I think we really need to adhere to is that the only times that I think that violence is somehow justified for leaders to use is when they have no choice, when they are really protecting themselves or the people from a great danger that is not an abstract danger or an ideological danger or a fake danger, but a real danger, clear and present, right? If someone attacks you, someone invades you, if someone is preventing you from physically moving, someone is locking you, someone is oppressing you in a concrete way. And we have instances of that in history. And anyone who knows about the colonial past of today independent countries that had to fight for their freedom knows exactly what I am talking about. And even the nonviolent activists in India never thought that violence was evil or illegitimate as a struggle against colonialism. They thought it would be less effective. And they also believed that violence hurt themselves as well. So it wasn't out of pity for the poor British that people avoided violence. It was because they believed that the cause would be more powerful and the fight would be more powerful through nonviolent means. So let's make that distinction very, very clear. Then art. Yes, I use art a lot in the book and in my teaching because I think that, again, these are things that in India, in China, in America, wherever you are, you will see art. Art is preserved. Art is valued by societies. We have museums. We have beauty that we can appreciate. And art conveys emotion, conveys feelings. It conveys also the ability for us to connect to people. So even the depictions that I showed you of particular leaders through art, I think resonate. So it's not something I think that we can quantify. And I know for economists, anything that we can't quantify is very frustrating because it's not empirical. But I think that we cannot deny that art, and by this I also include music, I include the visual art, I mean written art, those play a significant role in our lives. And any serious student of leadership needs to understand art as having an influence on the way we think and the way that leaders present themselves.
So, yeah, I was wondering in the US system, it's a very interesting point that the candidates are unpopular and the parties have selected them. It's a system that selected them. But there are some independent candidates. I think one of the Kennedys was there. And do you think an independent candidate would stand a chance then?
No,
You know,
no. It has happened in the past and it has never worked, ever. And it's not going to work this time either. For Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is the son of Robert F. Kennedy Sr., who was a very important person in the 1960s and was assassinated in 1968, and the brother of John F. Kennedy, the former president, who was also assassinated in 1963. So no, he will not be elected, and there will be no third party. Third party candidates are usually what I would call protest candidates. They're people outside the parties who are presenting an alternative because they recognize that there is a frustration. The biggest attempt was Bernie Sanders in the United States twice, 2016, 2020. He was not a third-party candidate, but he was an independent, meaning that he was not a
Right.
member of the Democratic Party, but he ran in the Democratic Party because it was his only chance, and he actually didn't get too far. Sorry, he didn't get. He wasn't that far from winning, but in general, you have to go through the two parties because of the way that the system is built. I won't get into too much detail, but that's the system in the United States. And so that's why you will never see, at least in our lifetime, you will probably never see a third, even Donald Trump, he had to run, or he ran in the Republican Party because that's the means through which people can actually run and win.
Yeah, it's really sad.
Someone
You
asked in
know,
the chat if, I can't see it now, but someone asked if do I talk about bad leadership? And that's actually a good question. I do talk about bad leadership. I didn't talk about so much here now because I didn't actually say everything that's in the book, but bad leadership is very important to study. And one of my arguments is that we can't just learn from success stories. And we have a tendency, if you walk into an airport or a bookstore like that and you say, I want to look at the books on leadership, very often it's about success. It's about success in business. It's about winning. And I understand why that happened. That's part of our individualistic culture. But we learn just as much from failures. We learn just as much from cases of failed leadership because that's how we avoid making the same mistakes. And that's how we see what was the thinking that went into it that was misleading. And what's really interesting is not if you tell me, well, such and such a leader was very incompetent and not very bright when they entered office and they failed, that's not very interesting to me or you. But what's really interesting is when we have a leader who has all the qualities, but is unsuccessful. Herbert Hoover is actually a good example. We would expect someone like that to do well because of his qualities, because of his education, because of his preparation, his seriousness. And yet, that is a story of political failure, of leadership failure in a moment of crisis. And we have to study that. We have to study to see why a talented person failed, why someone who we might expect to succeed failed, someone we might be rooting for failed. And we learn just as much from that as from the case of FDR, who was politically successful.
Your comment on violence, that's very true. Your comment on violence, that you would only sort of say it is valid when there's some concrete danger. But very often the danger could be imagined, in a sense, or violence. Like the US has got to many wars in many Middle East countries, and which have been protracted, and they've not brought any solution, but brought endless, further rounds of violence. And as you were saying, Israel created Hamas. So then very often leaders seem to imagine some danger, and they collect people around them with that idea, so which is a kind of marketing of a false idea, playing on people's worst fears. So you would say these are bad leaders, but then they are the ones that are successful, that get people behind them. So
yeah, sometimes, not always, but sometimes. But you're right. It's not so much that they imagine; it's that they scapegoat. They want their followers to believe that this is true. Sometimes they believe themselves that it's true, but it really doesn't matter, because often any kind of scapegoating is going to be false. It's going to be a deflection. It's going to be a distraction from real problems. So part of our response, we also have response. It's not just the leaders who have responsibility. All of us have responsibility also to hold our leaders accountable, especially in a democracy. So you might even support a leader, but if the leader does something which is dangerous to a group of people, and you see that this leader is doing it for political purposes, or for short-sighted purposes having to do with their particular interests, then we have a duty to try to stand for our fellow citizens if we feel that they're being scapegoated, and be brave and hold our leaders accountable. And it's true that some leaders in history in the same crisis responded in different ways. So for example, during the Great Depression, we have the rise of Hitler in Germany. The first thing he does when he comes to power is he says, well, you have a crisis and I'm going to tell you who is responsible. It's the minorities, and we're going to get rid of them. Now, on the other hand, you have Roosevelt, who also is responding to the same crisis, but he doesn't deflect or scapegoat minorities. He says, we are in this together. We are going to try to get out of this crisis together, and we're going to work on something called the public good. And there's no exclusion of any ethnic group or any religious group. On the contrary, he's actually quite inclusive in his policies. So we have to discern between these kinds of leaders. They're not always going to tell us, you know, I'm manipulating you, I'm being selective. We have to learn as much history as we can so that we're able to tell them apart.
Yes, that is an excellent reason for reading, learning history. Like they say that if you don't remember your past, you're condemned to repeat it.
Exactly.
So I think thank you for a wonderful session, and we all enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciated being invited. Remember, the book is easily available in India, and your loved ones will appreciate nothing more than the gift of a good book. It's good for any occasion, birthdays. Today's International Women's Day. There is also later in the year Father's Day, Mother's Day, Earth Day, Diwali. All kinds of, any occasion is good for a book. So don't hesitate to get your hands on the book and reach out, especially read it and reach out to me with any questions or comments or thoughts that you might have.
Okay, thank you, Charan. And
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much, Moshik. It's a fantastic discourse. I think all of us really enjoyed it. And as Professor was mentioning, very interesting, very engaging. I was only worried and I thought somewhere it'll come out, but it seems well-trained economists and well-trained historians have never made it that far. So we can rest in peace. That's something good. But
I'm glad.
I can easily see that, and I'm going to, of course, buy the book and read it further. Who becomes leaders? How do they become so popular? Be it Hitler, as you mentioned, or Roosevelt, how do they become so popular that they become indispensable for the system? So thank you so much for that discussion. I also noticed that at the fag end, you were mentioning about the depression, an economic factor, and how does a leader handle it? So many times I think economic issues become important. And if a leader has a command over the economic issues and the right way to command it, and great example that you gave between Hitler and the American president, one knew, made it very inclusive, the other knew where to put the blame. So I think that becomes then a real good example as to economic issues that are there in the system, and a leader can command it and through that become popular. It's good in the long run. So thank you very much. Very thought-provoking for we economists who generally assemble here and discuss. I thought this is something very interesting that you have shared with us. Thank you. Next week, we have, I think, another fascinating topic. The topic is tax burden on farm and non-farm sectors in India. Dr. S.L. Shetty, former advisor, Reserve Bank of India, and now in his 80s, is going to be discussing about this book, which he wrote this book, I think, about 50 years ago. And so I think it's going to be a great lesson for us in economic history, and of course, identifying how over the period of time, the whole thing evolved. I would like to invite all of you. The time is going to be from 4 to 5, and I look forward to your coming and also participating in that. Today is Mahashivratri, a great festival. I know many of you are going to stay awake tonight. Many of you are going to watch from Isha the Mahashivratri events. I wish you all the best. And then the weather is very, very good and pleasant in our country these days. Enjoy a great weekend. And I look forward to hosting you next week again on an important topic of tax burden. Thank you very much once again, Professor Goyal. And thanks a lot, Moshik, for that discussion on the book. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Night.